There is a sentence Mark Carney said publicly on May 1st, 2026, that Washington has been reading very carefully ever since. And most American coverage completely missed what it actually meant. United States Trade Representative Jameson Greer had just told a room full of Canadian politicians and trade officials in Washington that Canada should not attempt to use its energy and natural resources as leverage in negotiations. He said it directly. He said it with confidence. He said it as if the answer was already settled. Then Carney was asked about it publicly, and he said something that stopped people in Ottawa, in Houston, and in energy trading desks across North America cold. He said, "Is it in our mutual interest to trade more? Where is it? And if it's not there, we have other options." 5 words. We have other options. Not we are still committed. Not we value the relationship. Not we remain hopeful about deeper integration. We have other options. And then he asked a question out loud that no Canadian Prime Minister had ever asked quite so directly on the record. Should we be further integrating our energy markets with the United States at a time they view that as leverage? That question did not come from a politician performing frustration for cameras. It came from a former Goldman Sachs managing director, a former central banker, a man who has spent his entire career understanding exactly what leverage means and exactly when to stop giving it away. And that question, those 5 words that followed it, may have just changed the energy relationship between Canada and the United States more permanently than anything that has happened at a negotiating table in decades. This is that story, and almost nobody has connected all the pieces. If you are not subscribed yet, hit that button right now and turn on notifications, because what I am about to show you is built entirely on verified, documented facts. And by the end of this video, you will understand why Washington is far more nervous about Canadian energy than any official statement admits. Here is what the mainstream coverage gave you. On May 1st, 2026, Prime Minister Mark Carney sat down for his first interview with the Canadian press since entering federal politics. He was asked directly whether Canada would use energy and critical minerals as leverage in upcoming trade negotiations with the Trump administration. He said no. That is the headline most outlets ran. Carney will not use energy as leverage. Some read it as weakness. Conservative leader Pierre Poilievre immediately questioned what leverage Canada had at all if energy was off the table. Natural Resources Minister Tim Hodgson had called energy and natural resources Canada's strongest cards in the renegotiation just 1 week earlier. On the surface, this looked like a contradiction. A prime minister pulling back from his own government's strongest negotiating position. That is the surface reading. Here is what was actually happening underneath. To understand what Carney actually said and why it matters far more than the headline suggested, you need to understand who he is and how he thinks about systems. Mark Carney is not a politician who learned economics as a talking point. He guided Canada through the 2008 financial crisis with more institutional stability than almost any comparable economy achieved in that period. He was then appointed Governor of the Bank of England, the first non-British citizen to hold that position in the institution's 300-year history. He spent 13 years as a managing director at Goldman Sachs. His doctorate in economics is from Oxford. This is a man who has sat in rooms where a single misread signal cost billions of dollars, who has negotiated with governments and central banks that held every card in the conversation, who understands at a level most politicians never reach that the most consequential moves are rarely the loudest ones. And here is the one thing every serious financial negotiator understands about leverage. You never announce it, you demonstrate it. Carney did not say Canada would stop selling energy to the United States. He said Canada was not talking about halting trade. He said Canadians honor their contracts. But then he asked whether Canada should be further integrating its energy markets with a country that views that integration as leverage over Canada. That is not a weak statement. That is a warning. And it was directed not just at Washington, it was directed at every boardroom, every bond desk, and every energy trading desk watching the negotiation unfold. Now let me show you why that warning carried so much weight. Because this story did not begin on May 1st, 2026. It began much earlier. And the numbers behind it are ones Washington has been trying very hard not to say out loud. For decades, the energy relationship between Canada and the United States operated on one fundamental assumption. Canadian heavy crude would always flow south. Always. The pipelines pointed that way, the refineries were built for that supply, the pricing reflected that dependency. And the dependency, Washington quietly believed, kept Canada manageable. The numbers behind that dependency were staggering. Canada sends approximately 90% of its oil exports to the United States. American Gulf Coast and Midwest refineries, particularly in Texas and Louisiana, had spent decades calibrating their equipment specifically for Canadian heavy sour crude. The BP Whiting refinery in Indiana, one of the largest in North America with a processing capacity of 430,000 barrels per day, was specifically modernized with Canadian crude in mind. That is not a supply relationship. That is structural dependency, the kind that takes billions of dollars and years to unwind. And here is what Washington built its entire energy negotiating posture on. Canada was so deeply locked into American refining infrastructure, so dependent on American market access, so geographically landlocked from any other serious customer, that eventually Ottawa would always come back, always compromise, always prioritize the relationship over the alternative. That assumption was correct until it wasn't. Because something happened in May 2024 that changed the entire equation. And most American coverage has never fully processed what it means. The Trans Mountain Expansion Pipeline came online, a pipeline running from Alberta to the British Columbia coast, adding 590,000 barrels per day of new export capacity directly to Pacific Tidewater, directly to Asia. The numbers that followed were not subtle. By November 2025, approximately 2/3 of all Canadian crude exports from the Trans Mountain system were going to Asia Pacific, not to the United States, to Asia. That was up from a roughly 60-40 split just 1 year earlier, and it was accelerating. China's advanced refineries had been specifically investing in equipment designed to process heavy sour crude, the kind Canada produces in enormous volumes. The discount that American refiners had long enjoyed on Canadian oil, historically $15 to $20 per barrel below West Texas Intermediate benchmark, had already narrowed to under $10 per barrel by June 2025, the lowest spread since 2020. That narrowing is not a small detail. It is the financial market telling you something has fundamentally changed. Canada's oil was becoming more valuable because Canada now had somewhere else to sell it. And then, on May 15th, 2026, just 2 weeks after Carney said Canada has other options, he signed an agreement with Alberta Premier Danielle Smith that could see construction begin on an entirely new pipeline to the West Coast as early as September 2027. A new pipeline to Tidewater, to Asia. That is the context Washington's negotiators were sitting inside when Greer walked into a room and told Canadian officials not to use energy as leverage. And that is why Carney's response carried the weight it did. Now let me show you what this means at the level where it actually lands, not in negotiating rooms, on the ground. In Alberta, energy workers have spent years inside an industry that was told its entire future ran through American pipelines, through American refineries, through American goodwill. The Trans Mountain expansion changed that calculation in ways that are still moving through Alberta's economy. Canadian crude production is projected to reach a record 4.85 million barrels per day in 2026, 80,000 barrels per day above 2025 levels. And the question is no longer whether Canada can produce more, it is where that production goes. For the first time in decades, that answer is genuinely open. In Texas, the picture looks different. Gulf Coast. Refinery operators had built their entire operational model around the assumption that Canadian heavy crude was essentially captive supply. No Pacific outlet, no Asian buyers, nowhere else to go. That assumption justified decades of pricing Canadian oil at a discount. It justified infrastructure investment calibrated for Canadian supply. And it justified a negotiating posture in Washington that treated energy as something Canada would never seriously threaten to redirect. The Trans Mountain expansion did not immediately disrupt those refineries, but it introduced something much more dangerous than disruption. It introduced uncertainty. And in energy systems, uncertainty is expensive. It forces contingency planning. It forces pricing adjustments. It forces the question nobody wanted to ask. What happens to our refining margins if Canadian supply starts moving in a different direction at scale? For workers in Texas and Louisiana whose jobs depend on that supply chain staying stable, this is not a theoretical question. It is the question that keeps operations managers awake. And for Canadian families in Windsor, in Oshawa, in Calgary, in every community where the energy and manufacturing sectors overlap, The direction this negotiation goes will determine investment decisions, hiring decisions, and supply chain decisions that will shape the next decade of economic life in ways that no single press conference will fully capture. Now let me give you 3 scenarios grounded in what the structural incentives actually support. Scenario 1, mutual integration on Canadian terms. The USMCA renegotiation produces an agreement where deeper energy integration happens, but on terms that reflect Canada's new optionality. The pricing discount American refiners have long enjoyed on Canadian crude narrows permanently. New pipeline capacity to Asia provides ongoing competitive pressure that keeps American buyers honest. Both sides benefit from the relationship, but neither side holds structural leverage over the other. This is the scenario Carney appears to be building toward. It requires Washington to accept that the old pricing assumptions no longer hold. Scenario 2, parallel diversification. No breakthrough happens in trade talks. Canada continues building out Pacific export capacity while maintaining existing American supply relationships under current terms. The new West Coast pipeline breaks ground in 2027. Asian contracts deepen. Canada's export dependency on the United States gradually declines from 90% towards something closer to 70 or 65% over 5 years. This is not a crisis for either side, but it permanently reduces American leverage over Canadian energy policy, and it makes every future negotiation look different. Scenario 3, structural rupture. Trade talks break down entirely. Tariff pressure escalates to levels that force Canadian producers to accelerate Pacific diversification faster than planned. Venezuelan crude volumes increase into American Gulf Coast refineries as the Trump administration pursues that relationship, partially displacing Canadian supply. American refiners face a painful transition period, recalibrating for different crude blends. Canadian producers face a period of lower realized prices while new markets mature. Both sides absorb real costs, and the integrated energy relationship that took decades to build begins an irreversible unwinding. This is the scenario nobody in either government actually wants, but the structural incentives for it are growing stronger, not weaker. I am not telling you which scenario wins. I am showing you what the structural incentives support. And right now, scenario 1 requires Washington to change its posture in ways it has not yet shown willingness to do. There are 3 questions that will tell you which scenario is actually unfolding, and I want to be honest that nobody has clean answers to any of them yet. 1. The new West Coast pipeline that Carney and Smith agreed to pursue will require sign-off from British Columbia and meaningful engagement with First Nations communities along the route. Those conversations have not been easy historically. At what point does that approval process become the real constraint on Canada's diversification strategy? And does Washington understand that political dynamic well enough to factor it into its negotiating timeline? 2. Enbridge, Canada's largest pipeline operator, recently approved a $1.4 billion expansion of its Mainline and Flanagan South pipelines, flowing Canadian oil to American Midwest and Gulf Coast refiners. The company explicitly said the United States remains the most logical destination for new Canadian crude export capacity. How do you reconcile Enbridge's commercial assessment with Carney's strategic direction? And which one tells you more about where Canadian energy actually goes in the next 5 years? 3. Venezuela. The Trump administration has been signaling plans to revive Venezuelan oil production and direct significant volumes to American refiners. Many of those refiners are designed to process heavy crude similar to Canadian oil sands blends. If Venezuelan supply scales meaningfully into the American market, does it reduce American dependence on Canadian crude? And does that change the leverage calculation in ways that actually weaken Canada's negotiating position rather than strengthen it? I do not know. Nobody knows yet. Remember where this story started. Jameson Greer, sitting across from Canadian officials in Washington, telling them Canada should not use its energy and natural resources as leverage. Delivered with the confidence of someone who believed the old assumption still held, that Canada was too dependent, too integrated, too landlocked to say no. And then Mark Carney sat down for an interview on May 1st and asked a question that had never been asked quite so directly on the record by a sitting Canadian Prime Minister. Should we be further integrating our energy markets with the United States at a time they view that as leverage? By the time he asked that question, 2/3 of Trans Mountain exports were already heading to Asia. The discount on Canadian crude had already narrowed by nearly half. A new pipeline agreement with Alberta was 2 weeks from being signed, and Canadian crude production was heading toward a record high with new Pacific capacity available to absorb the growth. Greer told Canada not to use its energy as leverage. What Greer may not have fully calculated is that Canada was already using it, not as a threat, as a fact, as a pipeline, as a contract, as a tanker heading west across the Pacific toward a refinery that was built specifically to process what Alberta produces. That is what leverage looks like when it moves quietly, not through announcements, through infrastructure. Subscribe. Turn on notifications, because this negotiation is not over. The USMCA review deadline of July 1st is approaching fast. The new pipeline decision is coming, and the next move in this story could arrive any day. When it does, you will want to have been watching from the beginning.